Hello and welcome to Traveling Through the Unknown as we continue our series looking at the life of Abraham. And the reason we picked Abraham, not only as I was praying did I sense God kind of saying, hey, let's go that way, but Abram had to go through a lot of unknown things like you and I are going through now. A lot of uncertainty and just taken step after step, day by day. And so we've been just looking at his life and picking up some principles of what we can apply to our lives. So I'm glad that you're able to join us. If you have a smartphone, make sure you have our church's app downloaded. Right in there, you can click on sermon notes and you'll find all the Bible verses and slides for tonight's session. So make sure you click on there and follow along with me. And if you've got your regular Bible, your hard Bible, your paper Bible, make sure you grab that. We're going to be in Genesis chapter 16, so you can open that up right now. And again, I just wanted to make sure that you're aware of two important things that are going on with the church right now. Number one, our Moldova trip, we're still scheduling that, and hopefully as things begin to open up, and we're able to get a better handle on things, we'll be able to take a trip over to Europe, Eastern Europe, and be able to help some church projects that a missionary friend of ours is attempting to put together. Troy and Heidi Darren were serving here in the Appleton area for many years before they joined the mission field and went out to Moldova. So make sure that you're aware of that, and if you like more information, you can contact our office or Dwayne Fairchild, our team coordinator, And the other thing is if you are not a member of our church and would like to be a member of our church, make sure you contact our office. We want to give people an opportunity who've been a part of our church for some time to go ahead and go through the 2 classes and the application process so that we can connect with you and kind of make that relationship a little bit stronger, a little bit more formal, and get you to be a part of our membership group that continues to help our church move forward. So make sure you're aware of those 2 things, our missions trip, and if you're not a member, we're going to have some classes towards the end of May where we'll be able to get you involved with those and so that you can get better connected through our church and help us as we continue to do what God has for us to do. All right, in Genesis 16, let's start with verse number 1. It says this, "Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had not been able to bear children for him. So she had an Egyptian servant, named Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, 'The Lord has prevented me from having children.'" Now we're going to stop right there just a second, because this portion of the story highlights something that we all do. I know I've done this. I'm probably pretty sure that you have too. And that is this. We like to blame God. When things aren't going right, whether it's in the world or in our lives or with somebody else, somewhere along the line, God is going to get the blame for what's not happening and what's not happening right. And so right here in the story, Sarai starts right there and she says, "The Lord has prevented me from having children." Like it was God who was doing this to her. Now, God had promised a lot of great things, and we've been through that, and God had promised Abram and Sarai that they were going to have descendants, but at this point, things are not feeling so good for Sarai, and she's getting a little bit frustrated. So not only do we like to blame God, but like as the story unfolds tonight, we like to create our own plans. Instead of continuing to follow along faithfully into God's plans because he's either not moving fast enough, or maybe he's not moving in the way we thought he would, or maybe we don't see him moving at all, we like to go ahead and say, this is what I'm going to do. And you've probably been there. I know I've been there. We like to think that we can solve problems our way. We think that the big problems in life, the difficulties we face in life, and you know what? I don't want to make a blanket statement to say that, okay, you just got to sit around all day and pray and just ask God to do every little thing for you and you never take any steps or do what you need to do. There's a lot of things that are already outlined in the Word that we can follow and that we need to stay in line with. But there are some times that God has asked us to do something specific, or he's challenged us about something specific, or he said he's going to do something specific. And we think we can make that plan happen and we can solve it our way, contrary to what God has said. And so that's going to be kind of the theme of our story, but I think it's timely because we each and every one have probably had a lot of things that have been out of control in our lives lately. Not being able to travel like we want and do the things that we typically do, many not working, some being very ill and sick, some having to deal with a lot of these different issues. And, we're just praying and seeking God and asking for his help, and sometimes we're not hearing specifically, or God says to us, wait, and we have a hard time with that. So we come up with something that we think will work, and we try to make things work out our way. And a lot of times it doesn't work out very well. Well, let's see what happens in this story. Picking up with verse 2, remember Sarai said, the Lord has prevented me from having children. So Sarai says to her husband Abram, go and sleep with my servant. Perhaps I can have children through her. And Abram agreed to Sarai's proposal. So Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian servant and gave her to Abram as a wife. And this happened 10 years after Abram had settled in the land of Canaan. Now, the first thing that stands out to me is that Abram agrees to this thing. Not a wise decision. And then here's the thing that I want all of us, especially you guys who are being a part of this with me, is that sometimes we men don't lead our homes like we're supposed to. Sometimes it's us guys who are not leading the way that we need to lead so that the people in our family are making godly decisions. And in this instance, we see that. We had seen earlier that Abram had lied about who Sarai was in Egypt. And so in this point, Abram, even though he was a man of faith, decides to go with this different plan that Sarai had come up with. And we're going to find out how things work out. But Abram went along with Sarai's plan to circumvent God's plan. So Sarai's waiting to get pregnant. She's waiting to have children. And over time, and it says about 10 years, so we actually get a good indication about how long it's been from when God first spoke to them about having children till now. It's been about 10 years, and Sarai's been waiting 10 years for God's plan to unfold. So let's give her a little bit of sympathy or empathize with her, because we've been there where God has made a promise, and sometimes it hasn't happened. Sometimes it's been years that it happened, and sometimes we can begin to question, why isn't this happening? What am I doing wrong? What else is wrong in this situation? Sometimes we can begin to blame other people. Sometimes other people are blaming us because they're not seeing how things are working out the way that we said they would. If Sarai went around and told people, God told her, hey, I'm going to have some kids, and it's been 10 years, her friends are probably like, Sarai, I'm not so sure if you heard God right on that. It's been 10 years. But ultimately what happens is that Sarai comes up with this plan, and Abram goes right along with it. He's probably in that same boat. It's been 10 years, and we've seen God do miracles, and God has worked well, and God has taken care of us all these years, but the big promise hasn't come about yet, and so we're still waiting. And so together, now before Abram led Sarai down the wrong path, now this time Sarai is leading Abram down the wrong path. And again, guys, we need to do a better job about being godly in ourselves, doing what God wants us to do, and living our lives the way that God asked us to. So, let's go back into our story. Verse number 4 says this. So Abram had sexual relations with Hagar, and she became pregnant. But when Hagar knew she was pregnant, she began to treat her mistress Sarai with contempt. So here's Hagar's response to this whole situation. Now, we haven't really heard much from her yet. The only thing we found so far is that she's one of Sarai's servants, one of the employees that works in their home. It says that she's Egyptian. She's not from the area where they first came from, over in the Chaldean area by modern Kuwait, southern Iraq area. She's from Egypt. That's all we know so far. She's a servant of Sarai, and she's Egyptian. And then Abram and Sarai concoct this plan and say, here, take her as your wife, and maybe you can have kids with her. And so Abram and Hagar get together, and indeed she does become pregnant. But then she has a unique response. She treats Sarai, her boss, her mistress, she calls her in the story, with contempt. With contempt. She began to take her boss, her supervisor, her mistress lightly. She began to think, I don't have to listen to her anymore. She was probably aware of the promise of God, and maybe she began to think that, maybe this is what God has for Abram. Maybe it wasn't through Sarai. Maybe it's through me, Hagar, through what is going on. She maybe begins to think that she's no longer a servant, an employee, but maybe she's on equal footing, or maybe she's even a little bit ahead of Sarai and where she's at because she was able to have the kid where Sarai wasn't able to. Maybe she's thinking, I've surpassed her, so I don't have to treat her the same way I used to treat her. You know what? And here's the thing. Sarai's plan actually worked. Think about that for a second. Sarai had this plan to come up with and circumvent God's scheme, and the plan actually works. And sometimes in our lives, sometimes our circumvented plans work. Sometimes our circumvented plans work. Now, that's not a good thing. Sometimes that can let us think that because we do something wrong, that it's okay. Just because a plan of ours works out doesn't mean it was the right thing to do ever, or at all, or even portions of that plan. But Sarai here comes up with this plan to get Hagar pregnant, and that's how God's going to bless and move and get his plan moving forward. And sometimes we start to do these things that we shouldn't be doing, or we come up with these plans and they actually seemingly begin to work. That doesn't make it right, and what we're going to find here in a second is that there's more. But there are unexpected consequences. When we try to work outside of God's plan, there are unexpected consequences. And we're going to look at that in a second. Like I said, sometimes our circumvented plans work, but when we try to work outside of God's plans, there's going to be consequences that we don't foresee or that we don't think is going to happen. And you and I both know that as much as we try to plan and make plans and try to work things out and come up with our own plans, we don't always know the outcome. Even if seemingly the outcome seems to work, there are still other elements that are going to take place that we're unaware of and that we couldn't foresee. And that's where we need to make the distinction between our plans and God's plans, specifically when God says to do something specific. Specifically when he says to do something specific, sorry about that. But when God has a plan, he says, I'm going to do this, and then we try to get involved and make it happen the way we think it should happen, or it's not moving fast enough, we can't foresee what's going to come next, and there's often negative consequences. On the other hand, if we allow God to work, if we wait, if we trust, even if we have to wait 10 years, and that's where they're at in the promise process, God can see forward into the future. He knows as his plan is being worked out exactly what's going to happen. And we can trust him. That's one of the reasons why we shouldn't go outside of God's plan, is because he's the only one who can actually see what's going to happen based on every step that we take. If we trust him, if we follow his plan, he's got an idea of what's going to come next, when we really don't. And when we begin to get in there and we mess things up like that, now this whole story and this part of the story doesn't mean that God's plan totally falls apart, and I don't want to put that on you either. God's plan for your life is not totally falling apart when you make a mistake, but there are going to be consequences that we have to deal with. But I want to encourage you to trust God when things are uncertain, and even when he's spoken life and promises and he's got a plan. You need to wait and allow him to unfold it the way he wants. Yes, do what he has asked you to do, specifically in the word and according to his plan. But if he's asking you to wait, or there's been some time, continue to ask God, what do I need to do? But then wait for God if he specifically told you something, because he's the only one who can see the final outcome and even what will happen next. Well, let's get back into our story. Verse number 5 says this. Then Sarai said to Abram, "This is all your fault. I put my servant into your arms, but now that she's pregnant, she treats me with contempt. The Lord will show who's wrong, you or me." Great. Sarai's response to Hagar's response to Sarai's plan that Abram went along with, which is outside of God's plan, is this. Abram, this is your fault. Your fault. This is all your fault. Now, here's the thing. Ultimately, it is Abram's fault. He was supposed to be leading his family, and he went along with Sarai's plan. But at the same token, Sarai is laying the blame on somebody when it was her plan to begin with. This is what she came up with. This was her idea. And she brings back God back into the situation by saying, God's going to prove that it's your fault, Abram. Now, here's the thing. When things don't go the way we want, it's easy to blame. First of all, Sarai's blaming God because she can't have kids. Now she's blaming Abram because Hagar's treating her bad. And she says, God's going to determine between you and me who's really at fault, and it's going to be you, pal. When things aren't going right, we like to blame other people, right? When things aren't going right, we like to blame. So, it just hits me so hard how this all happens. Sarai is not taking responsibility for her own plan of action. Sarai isn't taking responsibility for one of her employees, her servant girl, to go and become Abram's wife and have kids with him. She's not taking any responsibility for that. Nowhere in there does she say, oh no, my plan failed. I shouldn't have done this. I was wrong. God was right. Abram, you shouldn't have let me do this. You could put some blame on him that way. But she could have somewhere along the way said that. But when things don't work out, we like to blame. That's exactly what happens. When things don't work out, we like to blame. Now, here's the next thing. Not only do we like to blame others when things don't work out, when we try to work outside God's plans, we try to get God on our side. When things don't work out our way, we scheme on how God can be on our side of the situation. So, like I was just saying a second ago, not only does she blame Abram, but she tries to get God back on her side in her plan. And again, I don't know if you've done this. I would imagine you have, because I'm in the same boat. When I step outside of God's plans, it's easy for me to blame other people, and it's easy for me to rationalize how I was right all along and how God was with me in doing the wrong thing all along. And that's exactly what Sarah does here. She's trying to scheme away. She's blaming God at first. Then she brings Abram into the scheme. Hagar messes things up. She doesn't mess things up. She actually fulfills Sarai's plan, but then she treats Sarah with contempt. And then Sarai goes back and blames Abram, but then she also says, wait a second. God's going to be on my side. God knows that I am right. And it's astounding to me that she would do this, but it's something that you and I do often too. When things aren't going right and we get ourselves in trouble or we get trapped or we have to deal with the consequences, when things aren't going our way, we figure out how to make it seem as though God is on our side even in that negative situation. Sometimes the negative consequences come and we pray and we say, God, you've got to save me from this. When really we're the one who got ourselves in that mess. We really should, if we get ourselves into that mess, begin to think, I probably am responsible for getting myself out of the mess. Now, I'm not saying don't pray, and we need to pray. We need to say, God, I did get off track. I am in this mess. Can you now lead me in the right direction? But a lot of times what happens is we get off track. We go the wrong way. We get into a mess, and then we say, you know what? It's your fault. It's their fault. It's his fault. It's her fault. It's whoever's fault. And God, go get them. So, again, I'm not trying to get on anybody's case in specific with any of this, but just to make us aware, as we're looking through this, this is what humans do all the time. You do this, I do this, we all do this. Let's get back into our story and hopefully get moving in a better direction. In verse 6, Abram replies, look, she is your servant, so deal with her as you see fit. Then Sarai treated Hagar so harshly that she finally ran away. It's not getting any better. Sarai is complaining, and Abram relinquishes all responsibility back to Sarai again and says, Sarai, hey, if she's giving you problems, she works for you. She's your servant. You handle it the way you want to handle it. I don't want to have anything to do with it. This is his wife. This is his son. He doesn't want to step in and try to bring correction and mediate these things going out. Now, I would imagine that Sarai and Hagar had probably had some of those difficult conversations about things not going right. And so Abram says, I'm not going to get involved. I don't want to deal with it. You deal with it, Sarah, any way that you want to. He's not taking that responsibility. And when things go wrong, the best thing that we can do is accept responsibility. The best thing that we can do when things go wrong is accept responsibility for what's happened. Again, before in verse 5, Sarai's blaming everybody. Abram comes in and he's like, hey, I don't want to have anything to do with it. You deal with it the way you want to. Nowhere in this story does Sarai again say, this is my fault. Nowhere in this story does Abram say, I probably shouldn't have let you do this. Nowhere in this story do we see up to this point Hagar saying, you know what, maybe I need to treat Sarai differently or treat her better because things aren't going well right now. And you and I do that same thing. When things aren't going right, we don't want to take responsibility. But if we do that quickly, it shortens the consequence, I think. It shortens the amount of time that things aren't working out. It helps the relationship to move towards reconciliation rather than just blaming and avoiding responsibility. When we do something wrong and we just fully admit it, it's hard for the other person to keep yelling at us. It's hard for, of course they can. Of course they've got reason to if we've done something wrong to somebody. But if we say, you know what, you're right, I did wrong. Right, I am sorry. Right, would you please forgive me? And I don't know if you can right now, but I would ask that at some point if you could. But I want you to know right now I'm sorry for what I have done wrong. So Abram relinquishes responsibility back to Sarai. And Sarai begins to treat Hagar really badly. She's so cruel to Hagar, this pregnant woman, wife of her husband, the one that she gave, a servant of hers, to give to Abram. She treats her so badly that this pregnant woman runs away off into the wilderness. The whole situation is messed up and it's spiraling downward quickly. And I don't know if you've noticed either, other than God being blamed or Sarai trying to manipulate the situation so it looks like God is on her side, we haven't heard God's voice so far. Here's the good news. God's getting ready to intervene. And that's something we've seen in other stories, is God will allow us to move in our own direction and make our own plans and do our own things. But he'll let us get out there to some places where there are consequences that we'll have to deal with before he'll begin to intervene. Let's look at what it says in verse number 7 and verse number 8. So Hagar runs away in verse 7. The angel of the Lord found Hagar beside a spring of water in the wilderness along the road to Shur. The angel said to her, Hagar, Sarai's servant, where have you come from and where are you going? I'm running away from my mistress, Sarai. My mistress, Sarai, she replied. So just a very simple thing, and this is something I want to encourage you with, because it's been kind of a negative situation. We've looked at human nature and who we are and some of the flaws that we have and some of the habits and the way we deal with problems and responsibility and consequences. But here's some good news. God searches for us. God searches for us. When we get off track and we get going the wrong way and we find these negative consequences, oftentimes God shows up right then and there and he begins to talk to us. He's looking for us. Hagar was Sarai's servant and employee. Hagar was a part of Abram's horrible plan. Hagar became a wife to Abram at Sarai's request. Hagar became pregnant according to Sarai's plan. Hagar had no respect for Sarai. Hagar was severely mistreated by Sarai, and Abram allowed all of that. And Hagar ran away from this dysfunctional situation, and God went and found her. I think that's amazing. That's incredibly amazing. And I just want to sit here for a second. Is that okay? Even if you want to take a moment to pray or thank God, or maybe if you just need to start looking around and maybe opening your ears to hear that God is speaking. But whatever situation you find yourself in right now, God sees you. He cares about you. He's working on your behalf, and he wants to be involved in what's going on. He wants to help. He wants to give those assurances and wants to strengthen you and wants to get you back on track. So believe that God searches for us. That's amazing. Unfortunately, sometimes when God ultimately finds us, there's got to be a little bit of correction coming on, and it comes in the area of respect in this part of the story. The Lord called Hagar the servant of Sarai. Did you notice that? Did you pick up on that? The angel said to her, Hagar, Sarai's servant. He didn't say, hey, Hagar, how you doing? He didn't say, Hagar Johnson, how are you? He didn't say, oh, God sees you, woman of God. He says, Hagar, you're Sarai's servant. What's going on with you? I think that's kind of important. Hagar called Sarai the mistress or the boss. Did you notice that too? She said, Hagar, Sarai's servant, where are you going? And then Hagar replies, I'm running away from my mistress Sarai. Now, it wasn't too long ago that Hagar was treating Sarai with contempt and saying, you know what, I don't have to respect you at all. But here in this conversation, the angel of the Lord says to Hagar, you need to understand who you really are and where you're at. You work for this family. And then in that moment, too, I don't know if it's in that moment or she's been running away, thinking, and it comes to her mind that finally, you know what, I probably am part of the blame here. I didn't hatch Sarai's plan. I didn't prove Sarai's plan like Abram did. But after I became pregnant, I was culpable. I did some things that were my responsibility. And in this moment, you can see that there's a little bit change in attitude there. Not only does the angel point it out, but then Sarai begins to actually understand that. And this is what I want you to understand about that. Sometimes the negative consequence teaches us a lesson. We always want to avoid consequences, but sometimes those consequences, especially the negative ones, teach us a lesson. And I don't know about you, but I learn more from the negative consequences than the positive ones. And I'm sure you do too. And that's just kind of how that goes sometimes. But we need to understand that that's a principle of life. We shouldn't try to run from the consequence. You know, if you were listening on Sunday to Roy McCain's message for us in our series, Life in the Spirit, he said something really interesting that I took note of. He said we need to ask God when we're in a given situation, teach us what we need to learn in whatever situation we find ourselves. And he talked about that concept of sometimes we like to blame the devil, or we think that all this is going on because of that. Instead of changing that whole situation and scenario around, instead of assessing blame everywhere, saying, God, what do you want me to learn here? What do you want me to change right now? I'm in this situation. God, how are you going to use this situation to better me, to make me better, more like you, to be who I need to start being, or to do what I need to start doing? I think it's really important. And it's a change of attitude for Hagar, and it can be a change of attitude for us. Again, this was all about respect. Sarai, honestly, wasn't the best boss in the first place. She didn't treat Hagar correctly. She didn't do things that she should have been doing. So there were good reasons, and you probably have good reasons when there's some supervisor over you, maybe a teacher, maybe there's a supervisor at work, maybe it's even some kind of other authority in your life, and you're just like, you know what? They're not acting the way they should, so I don't have to respect them. Well, that's not really the way that works. Sarai did not operate in faith. So again, there's a building reason why we shouldn't maybe respect her. But Hagar didn't need to act disrespectfully. She could have still treated people with kindness and respect in whatever situation she's in, and we can do that same thing. Sarai did not need to treat her so badly either, but Hagar still wasn't getting it. It got to a really bad situation. And sometimes in our lives, whether it's respecting somebody in authority or somebody else in our life, they start to push back against us. Just because they're not always doing the right thing doesn't mean we don't have respect. Now, we don't follow along something sinful. I'm not saying that. But we still can give respect to whom people that need and deserve respect, even when they're not acting correctly. And things kept getting worse and worse for Hagar. Let's look back in our story in verse number 9. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her authority. Now, I know what you're thinking right here. It's a very short verse in this chapter, Genesis 16:9. Go back and submit to her authority. Now, when I first read that, you know what came to my mind? And I think you might have some other similar reaction. Oh, come on, right? When things aren't going well, when our supervisor, our teacher, or someone's mistreating us, sometimes God says, I want you to go back to that situation. Now, again, don't hear what I'm not saying if there is one of those extreme cases where something, someone's in danger or in physical harm. That's not what I'm talking about. But just because a boss or a teacher or supervisor or somebody in authority over you isn't doing everything right, and maybe they're even not treating you the best, that doesn't mean that you need to leave. Sometimes you need to stay and stick it out. And in this specific part of the story, God says exactly that to Hagar. Now here we go. God may ask us to stick through a difficult situation. God may ask us to stick through a difficult situation. When things aren't going well, we need to remember that God might have us to actually go through difficult things. Life in the Spirit, life in God, a God-driven life is not always about everything being perfect all the time. Sometimes we have to go through hard things. First of all, that's just life. There's hard things wherever we go and whatever situation we find ourselves in. Secondly, hard things help us get stronger. We're going to get into all different kinds of things like this, but let's think about this for a second. We're going to put ourselves in Hagar's shoes, and you might see that's a tactic that I use all along these stories. I want us to actually get into the story and see how we would respond in some of these situations. Think about it this way. Your boss makes you marry their spouse. You marry somebody else's spouse. The plan is working. The two of you have a child. So you start mistreating your boss. Your boss treats you so bad that you run away. You're pregnant in the wilderness. But then God shows up. And you expect justice for yourself. God, go get Sarai. Destroy her for what she's been doing, or maybe in our situation, get our boss fired because of the way that they are. And you expect God's blessing to come in. But then God asks you to go right back into that situation where you've been treated so badly and show respect for those in authority. Now, I'm not saying anywhere in this story that the things that are going on are right, but I am telling you this. God specifically told Hagar to go back and show Sarai respect. Don't treat her the way that you've been treating her. How would we respond if God would say that to us? And he may have already said that to you and you responded well. He may have said that to you and you responded poorly, not showing respect. Maybe you quit, maybe you worked for your supervisor, or maybe you were sending out some kind of complaints. Now, I'm not saying don't follow the things that you need to do to rectify and reconcile the situation. But how quick are we when God asks us to go back to a difficult situation? How quick are we to actually do that? And a lot of times we're slow and we don't want to. Well, let's go back in verse number 10. Then the angel of the Lord added, I will give you more descendants than you can count. And the angel also said, you are now pregnant and will give birth to a son. You are to name him Ishmael, which means God hears, for the Lord has heard your cry of distress. First of all, great. This is a promise that God had given to Abraham about having all these descendants. Now, through this little servant girl, Hagar, she's getting a similar promise that she's going to have all of these other descendants. So God is saying, hey, I know you're pregnant. I know you're uncertain about the future. I know you don't know where the next meal is coming from, where your next paycheck is coming from. And I know you've wandered off and you're in this wilderness spot. But I hear your cries, and not only are you going to be taken care of, but into the future you're going to have so many descendants you can't count that many. And on top of that, I want you to understand something. All those times that you were praying, as you ran away from home, as you were wandering in the wilderness, as you were uncertain about your future, every single time God heard what you were saying. And that's what it says right in verse 11. God heard me in my distress. That's what Ishmael means. Every time Hagar called out to her son, she would be reminded of this very moment and this very situation. This very difficult time, but a time when God showed up. Every time Ishmael heard his mom call his name or somebody else call his name after he was old enough to understand, he would remember this story that his mom would reveal to him. He would remember that God hears me in whatever situation I find myself in. And in verse number 12, we go on to read this, though, something a little bit distressing. It says, this son of yours will be a wild man, as untamed as a wild donkey. He will raise his fist against everyone, and everyone will be against him. Yes, he will live in open hostility against all his relatives. Now, again, this shows us there are good and bad happening in the world all the time. God is going to take care of Hagar. Ishmael's got this amazing name, but Ishmael's got his own attitude problems that you're going to have to deal with, and he's going to have to deal with. And that's what I want you to know. Life has good and life has bad. That's life. Life has good and life has bad. But here's some more good news for Hagar. I don't want to get all that doom and gloom, but there's more good news for Hagar in this story. Verse number 13. Thereafter, Hagar used another name to refer to the Lord. He had spoken to her. She said, "You are the God who sees me." She also said, "Have I truly see the one who sees me?" In verse 14, so that well was named Bir lahai-roi, which means well of the living one who sees me. It still can be found between Kadesh and Bered. And here's the thing. Not only does God hear you, but God sees you. God sees you. The angel revealed God to Hagar in a unique way, saying that God hears your cry. And Hagar responds to say, God not only hears me, but he sees me too. And we get this new insight into who God is. Remember, this is early on in God's relationships to humanity. And we're only this far into the book. It's just a little bit into the book. And we know how the book ends. We know who Jesus is and how Revelation unfolds and all of that stuff. But right here, right now, this little girl who was from a different land, working for this other family, who got caught up into this incredibly odd situation. And she has to run away. But in that moment, she encounters God. God hears her cry. God sees her plight. And Hagar finds all this in her distress. And in your distress, you need to remember that God sees you right where you are in whatever wilderness you find yourself. Whether you're in the wilderness of depression or pain, difficulty, quarantine, illness, hurting physically, emotionally, relationally, maybe feeling abandoned like Hagar did. It can feel like you're all alone, but you're not alone. God hears your prayers. God sees right where you're at. This little servant girl who was treated so poorly, and this incident, which was a product of people not acting right, not acting in faith, created a revelation of God Most High. A revelation that we had never seen before. And I want you to understand that God hears and sees you in your difficulty. He just might not take that difficulty away. He might ask you to stay in that situation. He might ask you to tough it out, and it's going to build strength of character in you. But you are never, 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 never alone in those circumstances, even in the pain. I can't explain it all, and I wish the bad had never happened to you. I wish it was instantly removed, the consequence of your mistakes or the consequences of other people's behaviors. I wish you had better relationships in your life. I wish things were so much different right now. But in life, you know that is not the way that things work. But you're not alone. Make your prayers. Show God your distress. And he just might very well show up in your life and be there to help you. It was here in the most difficult time of this young woman's life that she's ever experienced, that she began to experience God in the most powerful way that she had ever experienced God in her life. God showed up and spoke to her. God prophesied over her. God promised an untold number of descendants, even from this horrible situation. And this is what I want you to understand. Sometimes in our most difficult moments, we experience God the most. Sometimes when it's the worst, we experience God the most. And it's a weird dynamic how that happens. And I'm just telling you that's what happens. I'm not trying to explain all the reasons why and all of these different things. I'm just saying it happened in Hagar's life. It's happened in my life. It's probably happened in your life. But when you're in those really struggling situations, if you turn toward the Lord, you can experience him in a way that you've never experienced him before. He can speak to you. He can hear you. He can reveal himself to you in new ways. And you can experience him like you've never experienced him before. And he can settle some of those things to say, you know what? Life isn't right. You know what? Things aren't going in the right direction. You know what? Things are going wrong. And yet God still loves me, and I can still connect with him. Let's conclude chapter 16 and our time together here. In verse 15 and 16, it says this. So Hagar gave Abram a son, and Abram named him Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Ishmael was born. Hagar obeyed God, went back to Abram and Sarai with a different attitude. That's what this last part of the story tells us. Hagar went back. She ran away because she was mistreated. She was mistreated because Sarai was being rude to her. But Sarai was being rude to her because Hagar was being rude to her. And you know the whole story. We just went through the whole thing. But she went back, obeyed God, and she had a different attitude. And I want you to know two things. Obedience is always important, and attitude is always important. Obedience and attitude in whatever situation you find yourself in. You don't have to have a negative attitude. You don't always have to be on the attack. You don't have to blame other people. You don't have to shirk responsibility. You can have respect for every person that is around you. You can show God's love and kindness to everyone that's around you, even when they're not doing the right thing. You can still do the right thing, and it's so, so important. Remember, Abram was 86 years old, so he's probably 85. Remember, I said 10 years after that God made the promise to Abram in the first place about having these kids and moving to Canaan. He's 86 now. It's been 16 years, and he finally has a son, but it's not the way that God had planned. And I want you to understand this too. Sometimes the promise and the challenge take a long time. If you've been waiting 15 or 16 years for your promise to be fulfilled, you might have to wait longer. And I hate to say that to you, but that doesn't mean that God isn't going to fulfill the promise. That doesn't mean he is going to stop. We got to continue to believe that God is working. And if you've been in a challenge for 15 or 16 years, I'm sorry you have to go through this difficult time. But God's promise to you is not voided. It's not going away. You can continue in him. And it might take some time for that promise to be fulfilled. It might be not until heaven for that promise to be fulfilled. It might take some time for that relief, for the challenge to come. It might not be until heaven until that challenge or that difficulty is removed from your shoulders. And I'm sorry you have to go through that. But I want to tell you the truth. That is part of life. Those are some of the things that we have to deal with. But remember, God sees you. He hears you. He cares about you. He's got promises for you. He's believing for your future. So let's look at some of our travel tips as we go through these difficult circumstances and as we're walking through the unknown. First of all, when things go wrong, stick to God's plan. When we're traveling and we're trying to get to a destination, sometimes things don't work out. We want to divert. Don't do it. Stick to God's plan. Secondly is this. Men, we need to lead our families by faith and righteousness. If you are not leading your family by faith, if you're not leading your family to do the right thing, the first place you need to start is with you. I need to start with me. Am I leading in faith? Am I leading by doing the right thing? Third, we need to beware of unexpected consequences when we divert from God's plans. We need to be aware of unexpected consequences when we divert from God's plans. We need to know that. You just need to understand that when God tells you to do something and you choose to go a different direction, there's going to be consequences. Sometimes they're not bad. Sometimes what your plan actually happens, but there's going to be consequences there. If you decide to divert from God's plans, there's going to be something somewhere along the line that you never thought of, that you didn't plan for. Just to let you know. Next thing, here, this is great. God searches for people. He searches for us. He's looking for us. When we're in those wilderness situations, in those difficult times, God has got his flashlight on. He's got emergency lights going. He's got the search party out looking for you. He is coming to find you right where you are, whatever situation you find yourself in. Here's the next one. We need to allow the negative consequences to teach us. We need to ask that question. God, what are you trying to teach me, or what can I learn right here? Not that God created the negative consequence. In this story, it was all Sarai, it was all Abram, and even Hagar had part responsibility too. It wasn't God doing this, but in this situation, God, what do you want me to learn? For Abram and Sarai, it was about being faithful to God's plan, and they still hadn't learned that yet. For Hagar, it was about attitude. So it could be different from all of us during these difficult times. We all could be learning something different. But God, what are you wanting to teach me, and asking him that and allowing him to speak that way to us? We need to be willing to go through tough times for God. If God asks us to persevere through a difficult situation or difficult time, we need to do that very thing. We need to go back to the situation, and we need to do what God has asked us to do. Don't be surprised by the good or the bad. Sometimes I think part of the biggest problem when we face a challenge is that we're surprised by it. comes out of the blue where we weren't expecting it, or we're expecting positive things, hey, let's just expect that, you know what, there's going to be good in life, you know what, there's going to be challenges in life, and when I'm not as surprised, it brings that emotional level down a little bit. Or when I'm not caught off guard, it brings that emotional level down a little bit. If I don't have to deal with the surprise of it all, I can maybe deal with the situation a little bit better. Oh, this is a good one. Remember that God sees you. Not only does he search for you, he sees you. He hears you. When you're praying those prayers and when you're in that wilderness spot, God's right there. And let that comfort you. Let him, just think of that right now. Wherever you find yourself, God sees you. He cares about you. That's just a great thing. Sometimes, the next tip is this. Sometimes it is the most difficult situations that we experience God the most. Sometimes it is in the most difficult situations that we experience God the most. You know, I don't want you to have to go through those difficult times, but you can experience God in a powerful way during those difficult times. In difficult times, we still need to obey. Hagar had to go back and live with Abram and Sarai still. And we still need to obey God, even when things are out of control, even when things are not going right. Just because things are not going right doesn't give you the right to do something wrong. In difficult times, we still need to obey God. And here's the next one. In difficult times, we can still have a good attitude. Imagine Hagar going back and having to look Sarai in the face again. Sarai had been mistreating her. Sarai knew that Hagar had run off. Sarai had all the control. She was in authority over her. Abram listened to Sarai more than Hagar. And still Hagar showed her respect. She didn't respect the negative things that she did or the things that she did wrong, but she still respected that person. And in difficult times, we can still have a good attitude. We can still treat people the right way. Well, those are our travel tips. I'd like to encourage you to take a few moments and allow God to speak to you. I'm just going to pray and then just take a few moments and say, God, what are you talking to me about? Maybe rereading Genesis 16 or looking through some of these travel tips or the notes from tonight. Heavenly Father, thank you for always being with us, for seeing us, for hearing us, for searching for us. And God, I know you don't create a lot of these negative situations we find ourselves in, but you can still bring good out of it. And Lord, you can even sustain us as we have to walk through these uncertain times and these difficult circumstances we find ourselves. So God, bless each and every person. I pray you speak to us in Jesus' name.